Hello, good evening. Please grab a seat. I'm Dan Hummel. I'm the Director of University Engagement here at Upper House. And I want to start by saying that I'm not supposed to be the one that's delivering the introduction. That is David Fields, the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies. However, he has become suddenly ill in the last 24 hours. And so I'm here to deliver his introduction. These are his words. Though I support all of the words. So it's a true honor to welcome Ian Johnson to Madison. Ian Johnson is a journalist, writer, and public intellectual who's been engaged with China for the past 35 years. He's currently the Senior Fellow for Chinese Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as a contributor to the New York Review of Books and the New York Times. He's the author of 3 books and a contributor to many more, and has covered China for the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and many other publications. He's received numerous awards recognizing the importance of his work on China, including a Pulitzer Prize in 2001, a Shorenstein Journalism Award in 2017, and a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Grant in 2020, just to name a few. He has also had academic appointments at the Beijing Center for Chinese Studies, Harvard University, and he's currently pursuing a PhD at the University of Leipzig on Chinese religious associations. I'm very excited for this event tonight, not only because we have the privilege to welcome one of the leading authorities on China to Madison, but for 3 additional reasons. First, because this event has been so long in the making. Dan and I started planning this event in the fall of 2019, and Ian accepted our invitation for April 2020. Obviously, that event had to be postponed, and then again and again, until we despaired that it would never happen at all. It's now happening, and it's gratifying to see such long-delayed plans finally come to fruition. Second, I'm excited because I believe this event is the Wisconsin idea in action. At the Center for East Asian Studies and the UW as a whole, we take the Wisconsin idea very seriously. The Wisconsin idea has a complex history, but simply stated, it's the idea that the University of Wisconsin does not exist to serve itself, or even only its students. That the resources and the research of the university should be used to spur public debate and address contemporary issues. At the university, we believe this, but there's a tricky aspect of the Wisconsin idea. We can't do it alone. The Wisconsin idea only works when the university and community partners come together to provide a forum for such a dialogue. Otherwise, we're only speaking to ourselves. So I'm grateful to Upper House for this collaboration and for all of you in attendance tonight. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to put the Wisconsin idea in action. I should also mention that Ian is the second speaker in the Center for East Asian Studies professional series, which brings to campus individuals who do significant work on East Asian studies, but who do so outside the context of the university. It's our way of acknowledging that, as much as we love the university, we in the academy have no monopoly on the creation of knowledge. Finally and thirdly, I'm excited because this event is even more timely today than it would have been in April 2020. So much has happened in the last 3 years when we began discussing this event, from trade wars to COVID-19 to the Hong Kong protests. In this environment, it's now more likely than ever that our conception, not just of the People's Republic, but of the Chinese people themselves, will degrade into familiar stereotypes, the sort that Ian identifies in his book, The Souls of China. But Ian uses in that book the lens of religion to explore how millions of Chinese are consumed with doubt about their society and are turning to religion and faith for answers that they do not find in the radically secular world constructed around them. They're seeking answers to such questions as, why are we here? What really makes us happy? What is our soul? These are questions that cut across racial, ethnic, national, gender, and socioeconomic boundaries. They are questions that nearly all of us will grapple with at some point in our lives, whether we are religious or not. Ian's work offers us an avenue for empathy with the Chinese people beyond the stereotypes and the tensions of our particular moment. A timely reminder that the PRC is made up of 1.4 billion individuals, many of whom are asking the same fundamental questions that we are. Such empathy will not lead to magic solutions to the underlying causes of tension between the US and China. The gulf between our 2 governments, societies, and cultures is wide. But empathy can surely do no harm. Human societies are immensely complex organizations. The outcome of the interplay of ideas across hundreds, then thousands, then millions of minds cannot be predicted. It is especially in this context that we are delighted to welcome to Madison an individual whose ideas and writings spur us toward empathy and a more nuanced understanding of the Chinese people at a critical time for U.S.-China relations. Please join me in welcoming Ian Johnson.
Well, thank you for such a warm introduction, and I love the poster they had with the skyline of Shanghai and the clouds. It looks sort of like Gotham City, as if I'm sort of telling a story about Batman. And but I wanted to talk a little bit about obviously religion, and start with a bit of a historical overview on why religion began to revive. Sort of roughly in the 1980s, and what the government's reaction has been subsequently, especially over the past decade. The book I wrote came out in 2017, so it was in the Xi Jinping era, and it takes Xi Jinping and the recent crackdowns on religion into account, but obviously some stuff has happened since then, and I can go over that a little bit more in depth in the talk today. But I want to sort of start because I'm not sure about how familiar everybody is in the audience about China and religion, and so I thought I would just sort of start at the beginning with Lao Tzu 2,500 years ago. No, I'm not really. So anyways, you can say return of religion. The term itself might be problematic because religion never disappeared. Even in the high Mao period, there was still underground religious belief. There was still almost a deification of the leader, Mao. And so in some ways, religion never really disappeared and didn't sort of magically reappear after Mao died. But there's no doubt that when the party assessed the situation that it was faced with in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it had a pretty disastrous situation to grapple with. And this was for a variety of reasons. One was that when I went to China in 1984, China was still relatively poor. Mao had made a number of accomplishments in industrialization and turned China into a nuclear power and various things like that, but it was still a poor country. And many of Chinese leaders looked around East Asia and saw that other countries had surged ahead, even war-torn countries like South Korea, even the arch-rival in Taiwan, were much more prosperous than China. Remember people used to talk about the Four Tigers and all these other countries, and I think they realized that something had to change. And of course, we always tend to think about the economic policies that changed. They embraced the more free market and that sort of thing, which is true, but they also had to win back society in other ways as well, not just in terms of making people more prosperous, which is what the economic reforms that started in the late 1970s began to do, but they also had to, and this is a scene just a couple of years before I went to Beijing. These are diplomatic compounds that's right on Zhenguo Menwai. Now, if you look at this street, of course, it's blocked with automobiles, but this was sort of the China that even I saw in the early 1980s when I went there. And the party had been self-destructing in the Cultural Revolution, right? So the party itself was in a terrible state, and traditional religions and all religions had suffered greatly. The infrastructure of religion had been really hit hard, especially one could argue especially the traditional religions and I say tradition maybe in quotation marks, of Buddhism, Daoism, folk religion, traditional practices, which had been attacked as especially superstitious and backwards, and had been the target of modernizers in China even before the communists took power. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek also had an anti-traditional bent to them, but this really reached its high point in the Mao era. So as the party was assessing the situation, they realized they had to sort of unshackle or give back to society some private sphere. And so for religious organizations were allowed to revive. And what that meant concretely is that in the 1950s, the party had identified 5 acceptable faiths. These were actually also something that had started under the nationalists in the 20s and 30s, which was to try to organize religious life in associations, sort of on a Western model, so that religions would have interlocutors for the state to talk to. And so they had 5 faiths. They had Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, and then Christianity, for the purposes of the state, was divided into 2, Protestantism and Catholicism. So these were the only 5 faiths that were allowed. These associations were pretty much destroyed by the early 1960s, and of course in the Cultural Revolution they had no role, but in the Deng era they were revived again. Churches, temples, mosques reopened, seminaries reopened, young priests, imams, pastors were trained and allowed to go back. But I think when you look at the documents from the early 1980s, the state's idea was that religion was something that, in the true vision of a modernizer, religion was something that would go away. Religion was something for the little old ladies who still went to the temple, who still went to church. Okay, we're going to reopen the temple as sort of a sop to them, but basically, with time, this is going to go away. In the past, maybe we were a little too hard and trying to destroy it, but we're going to let it die a natural death. And this wasn't too different from what secularization theory, modernization theory in the West also posited, that with prosperity, religion would go away. What was surprising, I think, to the authorities was that churches and temples and mosques were very quickly populated by young people. And these photos that I'm showing now were taken, well, now it's almost a decade ago, but there's scenes that you can still see in China today. And here you see a well-dressed person with is that a Prada bag? Does anybody know does anybody know their luxury goods? Or is it a Coach? What is it? And when I was in China in the 1990s, one would always assume this was fake. Now you can assume it's almost certainly real, right? So she's probably got the real thing, a wealthy, prosperous person and at a temple praying. And this is the kind of thing that began to appear with growing frequency in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, that religious life came back with sort of a ferocity that I think caught the party by surprise. And so if you go to temples and churches, etc., they are quite popular. They still have a lot of people worship them. There's more and more social services and organizations set up around them. It used to be that people might just go to a temple, for example, once in a while, like at Chinese New Year or a couple of times a year like that. But you find that they have outreach programs, many of which imitate to some degree what goes on in churches. Churches, you have Bible study groups. In Buddhist temples and Daoist temples now you have classic reading groups where you read sutras or read the classics like the Tao Te Ching or something like that. They have calligraphy classes, they have martial arts classes to try to make the general population realize that they're sort of part of that culture. They're part of that cultural world. And you have also an increase in unofficial religions. And this is something that I think is really sort of the focus of my book. This is a well-known pastor in Henan who has written his own history of Christianity in China and had a small congregation in Xinjiang. And there were many of these churches and even temples organized outside of government, direct government control. This was, up until a few years ago, one of the largest unregistered churches in Beijing, the Zion Church. These were pictures. No, sorry, this is not. This is from a Catholic Mass. Sorry. This is from the Zion Church. And they had hundreds and hundreds of people who went to the church every Sunday. And they were unregistered. They were not part of the official state-run religious hierarchy. So with this increased space in society, religious groups grew just as other social groups did. And I think that's important to remember, that we had a growth in overall in civil society in China, in especially the 1990s and 2000s up until maybe, say, the late 2000s or around 2010. I'll get to the maybe turning point, but this was, just some more. The broader social awakening, private enterprise, small shops, lineage associations. These are clan associations, people with the same surname, but they often function as groupings for people in a village or town. They began to be revived. Even this is my favorite traffic sign that I saw. It's the Mammon cultural area. It's the Caishan is the god of wealth or the god of prosperity, but the dictionary translation is kind of funny. But this is in the god of wealth. I can't remember. I think this is it's in Henan, I think. Most of these things are in Henan that are kind of funny. No, I'm just kidding. But anyways, so they turn these into sort of, to some degree, tourism sites, but also places where people go and revive cultural practices. I think the state, and so here I want to bring us sort of racing forward a little bit up until the past decade or so. The state's reaction basically was that things had gotten a little bit out of control, and I think it's important in general in society. And I think that this is important to remember, that everything didn't begin with Xi Jinping, because this is sort of the story one often hears. Everything has to do with Xi Jinping doing this, Xi Jinping doing that. Actually, the crackdown, if you will, or the skepticism towards civil society was growing in the 2000s. There was an effort to rebuild the party and to rein in civil society. We saw this with social media. The most popular social media platform 10, 12 years ago was Weibo, which was this more open platform, similar to Twitter, where you can follow anybody you wanted and they could follow you. And that meant that you had followers people who had millions of followers and were real public figures almost in their own right. This got replaced with WeChat, which is kind of more similar, say, to Facebook, where you have to ask somebody to be a friend and they have to kind of approve you. And it's harder, unlike Facebook, you can't just follow people unless they're a public figure, but it's more tightly controlled. And so the Weibo still exists today, but it's not anywhere as influential as it used to be. And so this was this effort that began in the late 2000s. You can say roughly sort of after the Olympics. In 2010, they got rid of most public intellectuals off Weibo, and by 2011, the people who were called the big Vs, they were verified account holders. These are the people who had millions of followers. Sometimes they were movie stars, and it was just gossipy sort of stuff. But they were also people who had agendas, who were pushing things. They were also basically cracked down on. And then Xi Jinping's role, I think of him in terms of these trends as like a turbocharger of things that had already been going on. He has more, roughly put, he has sort of more power than his predecessors. His predecessors were constrained by various things. Xi Jinping has more levers of power. He was able to more effectively sideline his rivals, and he's the first ruler in the new generation after Deng Xiaoping who comes from this red aristocracy of people who have direct familial ties to the founders of the revolution. And so they form kind of a network. You might think of it like as an old boys network or something like that in China. And so this gives him also ways of spreading his influence in ways that weren't possible. And he very astutely, as we know, I mean, not to get too much into the political side of things, but he launched a crackdown on corruption shortly after taking power, and that allowed him to sideline a lot of rivals. So in any case, in terms of our interest, religion and values, he quickly identified values as an important issue. but he wanted to more effectively dominate what values and what religions are acceptable. And so his first stop after taking power was the History Museum, the National Museum of China off Tiananmen Square, to this history exhibition on the road, called the Road to Rejuvenation, which talks about how China was laid low, and the Communist Party brought it up again. And this was sort of a sign that he wanted to set the agenda on how people think of their past and think of society. This is a Communist Party hero from the olden days, Lei Feng. Lei Feng is one of these model communist heroes that many Chinese roll their eyes when they see him or see these pictures. He was supposed to be a selfless, just a screw in the machine, just helping little ladies cross the street and doing various things. A man of very simple education who somehow miraculously kept a fantastic diary written in very standard Chinese, not typical for somebody with an elementary school education. And somehow there was always a Xinhua photographer nearby to take photos of him, even though back in the 1960s, almost nobody in China had cameras, so this wasn't, a selfie that somebody took or whatever, took with their iPhone 14. This was a posed picture, obviously. And so when, you think about these heroes, it's hard to convince a lot of people, right? Like, maybe it works on the elementary or the high school level, and it's good enough for kids will memorize this stuff so they can get into college, but I don't think most people can really identify with a lot of these heroes. The party hasn't abandoned them. You still see bulletin boards around Beijing that have Lei Feng. You can see his image up there above the photograph with the hat. So he's still a figure, but in terms of winning over people, the party feels that it has to broaden its interest, its attraction. It still also rails against what it calls evil cults, 邪教, and the biggest 邪教 of the past 20 years was Falun Gong, which was attacked starting in 1999, 2000, and banned in a pretty ferocious police crackdown. There have been other groups. This is against the almighty God Christian sect. And so you still see posters like this around town, almost sort of de rigueur, to show that the party is still going to set the boundaries of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, much in the way that rulers in the past would determine what is orthodox and what is unorthodox. So these kind of things, or Falun Gong, and increasingly some Christian groups and some forms of Islam are considered to be unorthodox. And I'll get to that in a little while. One of the first places he visited after taking power was Chufu, which is the birthplace of Confucius. And here's the party secretary of Chufu. It looks like he's having a heart attack, showing Xi Jinping's Confucius's works. And in fact, about a year later, the party secretary was taken down on corruption charges. So it just goes to show there's a lot of money to be made in Confucius, I guess. But in any case, Xi Jinping made some anodyne comment, but it was highly symbolic, where he said, there's a lot we can learn from these books, or something like that. And this began some speculation in the early 2010s that the party was going to embrace Confucianism as a new kind of ruling ideology, but that hasn't really proven to be the case, but it has taken elements of that in its smorgasbord of things that it offers the population. Also, some elements of traditional faiths, such as Buddhism, have been embraced by Xi Jinping. Here he's meeting Xing Yun, who's the head of a Taiwanese religious Buddhist, I would call it more of a Buddhist proselytizing organization called Fo Guangshan. And Fo Guangshan has temples all around the world, and they are the first, really one of the first, or maybe the only religious organization that's been allowed to build temples inside China. And he has reading rooms and built a library and these kind of things, which are only possible with top level approval. So there's other backstories. This particular abbot, Xingyun, is a proponent of reunification between Taiwan and the mainland, and so he's sort of acceptable to the Communist Party. But these kinds of ties you wouldn't have seen in years past. And then I think, also worth mentioning is Xi Jinping's whole propaganda campaign about the China dream. This is a little statue that became the centerpiece of a giant propaganda campaign that was ubiquitous in China several years ago about the China dream. These earthenware figures are kind of the equivalent of Norman Rockwell paintings in the United States. They're sort of well known around China, and so some of it is simply anodyne statements like this, like the China dream is my dream, but many of them became also identified with ideas from the traditional canon in Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism, and just general Chinese culture. These kinds of things you see in subways. This is in the Beijing subway. And so it's talking about cultural self-confidence. The Chinese has to have cultural self-confidence. They have little info. The next poster down, which you can't see quite as well, is a little sort of informational cartoon about traditional practices in Beijing, traditional things that people do, such as certain things you do on certain holidays and that sort of thing. So I think these are the kinds of things that the party is trying to push, and also ideas from the Confucian canon, such as this is a famous one called talk and action, or speech and action. So walking the walk, not just talking the talk, or something like that, which is identified with this person, Wang Yangming, a Ming Dynasty philosopher, so roughly 500 years ago, who Xi Jinping says is his favorite philosopher. I don't know if that's true or not, but a few years ago, so Wang Yangming had a very interesting career. And when you think about his career in depth, it kind of undermines some of what the party might be trying to do, because he had stood up to the emperor and was banished to Guizhou province, which is way to the far in the south and sort of outside of the modern city of Guiyang. He meditated in caves and had a moment of enlightenment when he came up with these ideas. But the idea, and his key idea, is that every person has a conscience, and every person inherently knows right from wrong, which to me is challenging for an authoritarian state, because of course it depends. I suppose maybe Xi Jinping thinks everybody knows what's right and wrong, and I'll tell you what's right. And maybe that's his sort of idea. So around this cave, they created a Wang Yangming theme park where you can go in and see statues of him and halls. And there's a Wang Yangming real estate development on the outside of it, which has luxury apartments. And so, I don't know whether this, maybe people might find this a little bizarre. I found it bizarre, but I'm not sure whether people will buy apartments there or whether. But when we were there, they were bringing, it wasn't just some theme park that was empty. As is often the case, the party creates these things and then brings officials to learn from and have study sessions and retreats at these kinds of places. So just a couple days before we got there, the Central Disciplinary Inspection Commission, which is in charge of the corruption campaign, had held a retreat in the theme park. They closed it off for a few days, but the guide was telling us all about this and who was there and all the people like that. And they bus in people from like China Telecom and all the other big state enterprises to come and learn these kinds of ideas. So I think this is part of a broader effort to rein in civil society. So a lot of text here, but NGOs over the past decade have also, any NGOs that have foreign ties have also been sort of brought under control. As I mentioned, the internet and private enterprise increasingly has difficulty. For Christianity, I think it means reducing the role of underground churches. Let me just go through this bit by bit. the party talks a lot about trying to synthesize religion. Actually, almost all religions in China have been trying to synthesize themselves since entering China. I think all religions adapt as they move to new places. This is a Catholic pilgrimage site in Hebei province that adapts elements of Chinese architecture. And you can see other cultural practices, such as this is a traditional Catholic wedding, and you see Jesus in the middle, and the bride and the groom are in the foregrounds with their back to us, and they're going to go and kowtow to the parents. And so the kowtowing to the parents is sort of a traditional idea, but having Jesus in the middle is part of it. So you can see this synthesizing of religion. Buddhism synthesized when it came over 2,000 years ago from India. I think a lot of religions adapt and change. When the party talks about synthesizing religion, they talk more about control of religion and having religion more directly under state control. One obvious thing is the flags, are the flags, which you see at almost all religious sites around China now. You never used to see them. A decade ago, you could go into you would never see a flag at a temple or church or a mosque like this one in Dunhuang in Western China. So that's one aspect. And you could think of that as just symbolic. Perhaps it's not that big of a deal. In many countries, there are national flags flown at places of worship. I think this is, but it gets to be a little more insidious. This is a famous Daoist temple, and I just machine translated this for your elucidation, because you can see this is it's a famous temple. It has a famous well where there was things, but they've turned it into a base of patriotic education. You see the last line, to protect in order to remember the catastrophes and experiences in the war of resistance against Japan. So it's also, in some cases, to turn places of worship, when possible, into bases where you can learn the party's view of history. Here they are, the nuns at this temple. This is just from their WeChat feed. It's not particularly some sort of special thing, but this is them watching Xi Jinping give a major talk and learning from Xi Jinping. And so I think the party has, in trying to control the ideological narrative, it has two things that it's trying to do. For the traditional faiths, like Taoism, while there are elements of control, like flags and making sure you know Xi Jinping's thoughts, there's an incredible amount of construction in the traditional religious sphere. In Taoism, Buddhism, folk religious practices are all kind of booming. And this is at Maoshan, which is outside of Nanjing. This kind of temple construction is unimaginable in Muslim or Christian communities, right? You basically can't build a new, proper church with a steeple and stuff like that, unless you're replacing one that was maybe torn down as part of urban redevelopment or something like that. So there's not allowed to be any net new built places of worship for Abrahamic faiths, but for the so-called traditional faiths, because Christianity has had a permanent place in China for over 400 years, and Islam has been in China for over 1,200 years. So by at least American standards, these are pretty old religions. But the Buddhism, Taoism, folk religion have a clear preferential treatment. When they apply, they can often rebuild and expand temples. They only have to show that historically a temple once existed there, and then they can get the permission. But Chinese history is so long. Maoshan once had something like 5,000 halls on it in the Tang Dynasty. So if you were to replace all of those things, it would be sort of unimaginable. Won't necessarily happen, but the amount of construction, the preferential policies toward these religions is quite remarkable. Secondly, traditional cultural practices that were once persecuted or forbidden by the Communist Party as superstitious, and then were tolerated as cultural practices in the 80s and 90s, are now getting explicit government support as intangible cultural heritage. Intangible cultural heritage is an idea that comes from UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Science, and Cultural Organization, and it's to support practices that are, in other words, not the Great Wall of China, not the Forbidden City, but things that can be simply cuisine or dance or song, but also martial arts performances. Martial arts can be just martial arts, right? But it can also, many of these practices have their roots in religion. They were normal, and this is the case here outside of Beijing at Miaofengshan. They were performances for the gods. You perform at a temple. That's why they have temple fairs in China. You're performing at the gods, at the deity's birth date, and you are performing in his or her honor. So these kind of practices have now got direct government support. And in fact, I'm just seeing if I can, no, it doesn't say that it's intangible cultural heritage on their banner, but they're performing at a temple, and the groups that come up and perform gets direct government support. This group gets money every year, and then the temple itself, the pilgrimage itself, gets government support. So these are things that, again, in the past would have been unimaginable. These groups were, again, banned as feudal superstition, Fengjian Mixin. This temple is not a Buddhist or Daoist temple, it's a folk religious temple, and it now has direct government support, not as a new religion, but as cultural heritage. So this is the way they get around having to directly support religion. They can simply call it a cultural practice and give it money and support. And these attract a lot of people. These are tens of thousands of people go to this. This is the first evening of the temple fair. The problems with the so-called foreign faiths of Islam and Christianity is they're thought to have overseas allegiances. If you think of Islam, the global ummah, some Muslims were going overseas to be educated. And then the pilgrimage to Mecca itself is often viewed as highly problematic, and only older people in the community are allowed to go, like when they're over 65 or something like that. And the same thing with Christianity. It's not gone unnoticed that many pastors in China, especially in the unregistered churches, went to seminaries, especially in the United States, but also in Australia and other countries, Canada, and went back to China. And also that they download material from the internet from Taiwanese and, well, in the past, Hong Kong churches. So I think the government views these two religions with suspicion. In my book, I don't go into Islam because I'm looking at ethnic Chinese people, so Han Chinese people. The reason is that I don't speak Uyghur, I don't speak Tibetan, and going into the minority areas, I don't use translators in China, and I felt that it was too complicated if I was going to also include all the minority groups in China. The People's Republic of China is 91% ethnic Chinese, and I thought, okay, it's enough to have 1.3 billion people. I don't get the 100 million people who are in the minority groups, but other people do excellent work on that, and I'll leave that to them. So my book does not handle Islam that much, although obviously in the past few years you've probably heard about government policies toward Islam, and I would view that as primarily forced cultural assimilation. So the stories of people who are cadres, government officials will come to people's homes and sort of, if they see a carpet on the wall showing the Kabbalah, the place in Mecca, they'll see that as a sign of religious extremism, when in fact that's really common in Muslim homes around the world. Or if people are not eating pork and drinking beer, or if a restaurant isn't offering pork, or a halal restaurant is not offering pork and beer, it's seen as extremist. And so this is sort of what's behind, I think, these camps in Xinjiang. It's to drill out of people their religious practice. I don't personally, and this is maybe just an aside, we can get into in the Q&A, I don't necessarily support the word genocide. I think genocide for most people conjures up ideas of Auschwitz or Pol Pot or something like that. There are not piles of dead bodies we're talking about. Normally people will use the adjective, cultural genocide. That is perhaps more defensible. But in any case, the effort is similar to minimize the role of religion in daily life. So for Muslims, it's wound up in all Muslim groups being defined as minorities. So they're not considered to be Han Chinese. And so they do tend to live in more of the border regions of China. And this gets tied up in ethnic policies in China as well. So this is a photo of one of the camps. For Christianity, I see a two-pronged approach that's been followed. One is a shot across the bow of the unregistered churches in China, which have been the place of most of the growth over the past decades. As I mentioned, there are 5 officially accepted religions in China. One of them is Protestantism, one is Catholicism, but each of them have very large underground. I prefer the term unregistered because they're not often really underground. When you build a building like that, you're not really underground anymore. But they're unregistered. They're not registered with the government. So for these kind of buildings and these kind of things, the government has demolished some of them. You may have read about that. In some cases, blowing up buildings under the explanation that they don't have the proper building permits, which is possible because in China, so many things are done that aren't exactly 100% by the book. So if you're trying to nail somebody, you can probably always find something they didn't do quite right. This is also sort of the premise of the corruption crackdown. Probably most officials in China who grew up in the system, came of age in the system, were corrupt to some degree. So if you want to go after somebody, you can always find something that was corrupt. And so the same thing with these buildings. They said, okay, this didn't have the correct building permits. We're just following the law. They don't have the permits. We're going to demolish it. But it was all aimed at these large kind of mega churches. So the term also that people often use for unregistered Christianity in China is house churches. I think that was accurate, especially up until the 2000s. And there are still house churches, which are just small groups of people meeting in somebody's living room. But increasingly, and in the church that I describe in the Souls of China, they are large urban churches that have or had at least an ecosystem around them of kindergartens, daycare, even seminaries, bookstores, not to mention Bible study groups and so on and so forth. That's what the government wants to end. They want to end these kind of large organizations in China. So in other words, civil society. Because these are classic examples of civil society, which one might define as groups of people that are not directly under government control, that are self-organizing, self-financing. And that's what these churches were, and they continue to be, because there are still many unregistered churches in China. They're just smaller in scale. So these enormous churches have been reined in some cases physically destroyed, but often then the churches just go back to the smaller groups that they had before. In other words, Bible study sized groups of maybe a couple dozen people that would meet. This was also another campaign that took place shortly after Xi Jinping took power, which was to take the crosses off churches in Zhejiang province. Again, another symbolic effort to set the guidelines of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. I was really struck once when I drove into Wenzhou, which is sort of the capital of this movement on the coast of China, south of Shanghai, that there's an elevated highway that goes in from the airport, and you're a couple of stories up, and you're looking out over the city, And you see all these crosses, right? And so all the churches and many Christians would put these enormous red crosses on top of the buildings. And this is not the kind of cityscape that Xi Jinping and other party leaders want to have anymore. So they were forced to take the crosses off. I would say, I talk briefly here about Catholicism because it's the opposite tactic. So in the case of Catholicism, you recall I started off the presentation with the initial title slide with this picture. It's a holy site in Fujian province, and the government's effort in controlling Catholicism has been diplomacy. So that the main problem that the Catholic Church has faced since 1949 has been that the bishops have not been consecrated by the Vatican, and that there's been then this schism creating an underground church which have bishops that have been given tacit consecration by the Vatican, and then an above-ground church, some of whose bishops and then thus the priests have been consecrated by the Vatican, and some who haven't. And so this has created a crisis of faith for many Catholics. Can they worship in these churches or not? Because they're not they don't necessarily have the Vatican's blessing. So as you might know, about 5 years ago, the Vatican and the Beijing authorities came to an agreement where they would jointly appoint bishops. But this has been quite difficult. I went to one of the main sites of this in Mindong, which is in Fujian province, and this is an area with a very old Catholic tradition with old churches, and also martyrs. This was a martyr who died in the Cultural Revolution, and there's a small shrine to him. And a very thriving religious life. This is the underground bishop who was asked by the Vatican to step aside so that the government-approved approved bishop could take over this area, and he did because he felt that was what the Pope wanted, and the favored person, this person named Jan Salu, could take over. The government's so that was his. This was Guo's church, his cathedral, all built privately without government approval. But the government then built this enormous church in a dramatic piece of land overlooking the ocean nearby to give to the government-approved bishops. So it's sort of a message, a not too subtle message, that if you play ball with Beijing, you're going to get a beautiful church like this. This is after it was opened, and if you don't play ball, you're going to be in trouble. And so I think this is also sort of the message to the Protestant churches. Don't get too big, stay small, don't create civil society type structures, and we'll probably leave you alone. That's sort of the message. And in the case of the church here, I think this deal that the Vatican struck, I think for a lot of people is becoming increasingly difficult to hold to. There's more and more, I sense there's more and more criticism in the church toward this deal because the number of bishops being approved is at a snail's pace. It isn't really solving the problem. The problem is that there was a terrible backlog of bishops, therefore you weren't able to consecrate new priests, et cetera, et cetera. So it hasn't really solved that problem. I'm not sure how much longer it can really continue. I guess I'll sort of round off with some broader thoughts. One is simply geography. This is a map of religious life in China based on geography, and the green this is the predominant religion in a county. This isn't the only religion in a county, but the green is Islam, and you can see it's out there on the borders, Xinjiang. The yellow gold is Tibetan Buddhism. And I'm Buddhist in general, Buddhist in general, because that doesn't explain. If you go here, you can see the red is Tibetan Buddhism and the yellow is Han Buddhism. So overall, this shows, I think, that at least in crucial border areas of China, you have disaffected religious minorities. So I think religion plays, from the government's point of view, certainly an important national security role. And you have religion, I think, impacting the government's image abroad. We don't hear about too many protests against the camps against Uyghurs in Muslim countries, mainly because a lot of these countries are authoritarian states that have close ties with Beijing, and the protests are not really allowed. But there have been some, this was in Turkey, and people who are protesting it. You also see a lot of online opposition. This was the church that I wrote about in my book, which was closed down after my book came out, and it still has a very vibrant online presence. And I think it impacts how a lot of Western countries think of China's human rights situation. I don't mean just particularly this church, but the treatment of religion in general in China. I think it's had a huge impact in overall, including the Uyghurs and Xinjiang, in how, in the negative view that a lot of people have. If you look at the global opinion polls by Pew, this big, fairly reputable, I think, opinion survey company, they show China's image going starkly downhill due to a variety of reasons. But I think religion and this sort of online presence is part of it. I think also in the future you're going to see this closer effort by the government to meld party control with traditional values. I sometimes draw the analogy to Vladimir Putin and how he instrumentalized the Russian Orthodox Church. I don't think you're going to see Xi Jinping holding incense sticks and kowtowing before the god of wealth, but you will see, I think, the party more closely identifying itself with traditional values and traditional faiths and beliefs, and giving them a leg up as a way to counter the Abrahamic faiths. And I think the ultimate thing, which you'll see, and this is going back to the slide, you see I took this picture myself. I climbed up the rocks, and I'm right behind the statue, but behind me is a closed-circuit television camera. And so everybody going into the cave is being filmed, and not to paint, too Orwellian a picture, but with facial recognition software, it's not at all far-fetched to assume that it's possible to know who goes into every site of worship, every church or mosque, and to probably pretty effectively identify that. So, this could affect people on a daily level also, because some people might be working at a state enterprise which is run by the party, and there's a strong party presence in the state-run enterprise. And if you're going to a church, maybe you're not you don't necessarily have a cross on your lapel or anything like that. You don't even tell anybody you're a Christian. But if they then know that you're going to church, it could impact your chances of being promoted or something like that, even if you are just a very privately pious person. So these kinds of things, I think, have the potential to grow with time as the party refines its methods of surveillance and tries to control religion and faith as part of its nation-building project. So that's my final slide. It was a statue that had been unloaded in front of a Daoist temple, in front of a funny, not a funny, but a propaganda poster showing the 8 core values or something like that of the Communist Party. So with that, I will stop and open the floor for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. We have plenty of time for questions. The two rules for questions are keep it as concise as you can, and keep it in the form of a question. That's always appreciated. I'll start off as people are thinking of questions, but raise your hand. We're going to alternate back and forth. I'm over on this side. John is over there, and so we'll try to get to as many people as we can. Ian, I thought I'd start off just by asking, sort of on the diplomatic front, how does the stories you've told us, the history, does it shape at all how China interacts with other countries in the world? For example, does its treatment of Muslims shape at all how it interacts with Muslim countries? For that matter, does the treatment of Christians shape how it interacts with countries that have large Christian populations? And I'm just wondering if it's sort of an entirely internal story, or if there's also a diplomatic consequence.
Well, no, I think, as I was mentioning, I think in terms of the Muslim world, the response has been muted. There have been people, I think it was Imran Khan of Pakistan, who said he didn't believe the camps were more than just re-education for extremists, which is how the party portrays us, as extremists. And so I think especially countries that have close diplomatic ties with China, like Pakistan, and which are authoritarian and don't really allow too much, in the way of street protests and that sort of thing. I think they're unwilling to. I think also China has been a champion of the Palestinian cause, and I think that's also muted some responses. It's been probably most difficult in Turkey, because the Uyghurs are a Turkic people, and there were for a long time a large number of Uyghur exiles in Ankara and Istanbul. But Erdogan is also a strong man, sort of in the mold of Xi Jinping and Putin and so on. And I think he's sort of kept that down. I don't know if he expelled some of the groups. I think some of the groups wanted to have a big international meeting a few years ago, and he didn't allow them to come into. He didn't issue visas to those people who wanted to come to the country. So,
thank you. Questions?
The pictures showed a lot of younger people in certain circumstances. And I wonder if the traditional religions that the state is willing to accept and champion would be more acceptable and interesting to older people, whereas maybe the Protestant Christians, Bible studies and so forth, are more typical of younger groups. Would that be the case?
I think maybe that's overall true. Certainly, the Protestant groups have been better at evangelizing, basically because, in traditional Buddhism and Taoism, there wasn't a whole lot of evangelizing. There was this effort in the early 20th century there was a school called humanistic Buddhism, Rinjian Fojiao, and Rinjian Fojiao created groups like that group that I showed, Fo Guangshan, the abbot who met Xi Jinping. And they do go out and emulate some things by having scripture reading, sutra reading sessions and so on. But churches have been very effective in having, outreaches and Bible study and even learning English. And I know a friend of mine from Germany went over to China like 30 years ago, and she evangelized with her ukulele and would just sort of sing ukulele songs. They had a singing group, and then teaching a little bit of music and stuff like that. And then, you say, well, on Sunday we're all going to meet at my house for a church session, and then half the people drop off, but you do. So there is that effort, and I don't think the traditional religions have done it that much. Some of the folk religious practices do reach younger people. And I think that's because these are often family-based, and I think now with government support, it's seen as a higher prestige thing. It's no longer just some, those that martial arts group I showed with the guy with the two sticks like that. I mean, that's hard to do when you're old. You need young people to do those kind of practices, right? I've done that. I joined one of those groups as part of participant observer, and I got my head hit by a stick a couple times. Anyways. But you do need younger people, and then when you're getting a little bit of government money, the money is not really significant. For a big group that has national level support, they get 10,000 yuan, which is maybe $1,500 or less dollars. But it's the prestige, and when it's, especially because there's like 30 people in the group, so it's not like a huge amount. You're not doing it for that money, but now you're getting prestige. If you want time off work, you can say, oh, we're having a performance, we're part of this thing. All of a sudden, that's different. Now, if you want to get time off to go to a pilgrimage to the Virgin Mary, forget it, right? Like, they're not going to give you time off. But if you say, and I know one of the guys in one of these groups, a bus driver, he works at the bus company in Beijing, he can easily get time off work. Anytime there's a festival or a performance or whatever, and they're happy, they tout him. Oh, he's, in our bus company, and he does this thing, and it's like a great thing, and it's not even considered time off. So I think that's helping to bring younger people into these groups. But overall, I think Protestantism has done a better job, and it's sort of still the benchmark for how other faiths look to draw in younger people.
What sort of qualities does the party look for when trying to appoint Catholic bishops, and or qualities to avoid, and how do they come to a compromise with Rome on those issues?
In the past, some of the people they appointed seemed to have very few qualities. I know they appointed some guy who was married and had children, but at least not traditional Catholic values. But I think overall, I would say that the key thing would be pious, yes, but apolitical. So if you have a track record of sermons that touch on social issues, that would be problematic. And how they agree on it, they never actually release the mechanism, but one side, they meet and discuss names. And so actually who brings up the names, I think they kind of know, in which diocese there are senior enough people who could become bishops. And then they say, well, what about that guy? And they say, well, maybe not that guy, but that person we could agree on. And so they have these negotiations and discussions. But to date, only a handful have actually been approved. So it hasn't really solved the problem for the Catholic Church, which is solving the backlog of bishops, and therefore, because I can't remember the exact number, but it's about a quarter of bishop positions are empty in China. So that sort of freezes the way the church works in terms of being able to then bring in new priests and do work and stuff like that. So that's why I'm not sure. The Pope came under intense criticism when it was announced, and I think I wonder if it will continue much longer.
Way in the back here.
I heard that in some articles that said that China might become the largest Christian nation by 2030 due to population, since China has a much larger population than other countries. So do you think that if the population of Christians become large enough, it would be harder for the CCP to control, and the response of trying to control them might change over time?
Yeah, I think that I've seen that prognostication. That was based on flat line. So if you took, in 1949, there were roughly 4 million Christians in China, 3 million Catholics and 1 million Protestants. And now there's roughly 12 million Catholics, which just tracks population growth. But there's, the number of Christians, even if you took sort of a very conservative number of 30 or 40 million, that implies something like 8% per annum growth, which, if you know anything about compounding, the power of compounded interest, or something like compounded growth, the numbers grow very quickly, right? So that's where that number comes from, that it would go up. 2030 is around the corner. I don't think China has the largest number of Christians in the world. My numbers that I go by are more conservative. I would say there's something maybe like 50 to 60 million Christians in China. Some people say, 100 million, but these numbers often seem pulled out of thin air. The government figure is something like 30. But if you doubled it and just say, okay, if you just doubled it because you say, oh, there's easily as many underground Christians as above ground Christians. That would bring you around 60 million, but I don't think it's going to, I think it'll be harder to sustain that growth rate in the future given the government's policies. And I think it is, though, the concern about that that's driven this. Because in a way, the two Abrahamic faiths pose different challenges. For in case of Islam, it's considered a minority religion, and it has to do with China's territorial integrity, et cetera, et cetera. In some ways, Christianity is more of a challenge because it's the first foreign faith to really gain a permanent foothold in China since Buddhism. I mean, if you want to sort of, since Buddhism came in 2,000 years ago or something, right? So Christianity has, came and went, or Nestorians came and went, and so on and so forth. But since Matteo Ricci moved to Beijing in 1601, there's been a permanent Christian presence. No, it wasn't very large for a lot of that, but it stayed. And I think its growth is, I think, what is troubling to the parties, that vision I had before, of the state setting up this old-style traditional faith. Where does Christianity fit into that? Christianity has a different set of values. Certainly there's overlap in how to be a good person and stuff like that, but it doesn't fit into the government's narrative. So I think it is a challenge for sure.
Ian, you had a slide of the early rain church there, and I recall after reading your book, maybe once or twice I saw an update that you'd written maybe in the New York Times about, I think the pastor and maybe briefly his wife were incarcerated. I'm just curious if there's any information on that pastor and his family.
No, I don't think there's been, to my knowledge, there hasn't been any. I haven't heard of any update. If anybody knows of anything, I'd be happy to know anything. But I think he's in jail, and his wife and son, the last I heard, were living with her parents in a village or a small town in Sichuan province. And I think she's allowed to visit him, but I don't believe that any lawyers have been allowed to visit him. And I don't think there's any real knowledge of how he's doing, except I assume if he were really ill or something, that his wife would somehow get the word out. I assume the deal is that if she says anything, she can't visit him. Therefore, we haven't really heard anything. And I assume he'll serve the full sentence. I don't see them letting him out.
Hi. I'm wondering, in light of how things have been changing in Hong Kong in recent years, if what you see or what you predict you'll see in terms of how religion is handled there.
Well, it's hard. It's hard. Everything that's happened in Hong Kong has happened a lot faster than anybody predicted. I would have said in the past there'd be more autonomy, but now there's the national security law that's been passed, and I mean, people are worried about all kinds of things. I got a call from a friend who used to publish books in Hong Kong about politics and stuff like that. And the guy, he has, like a lot of publishers, they have stock in warehouses. And the warehouse owner was like, you got to get this stuff out of here immediately. So he called me up and said, do you know what we can do with these books? And I said, well, I'll take, as many as you want to send, and then I'll just send them to libraries. And so there's that level of sort of concern and fear. So I would think, people like Cardinal Zen have already been. Is he arrested? Is he still arrested, or is he just? So there are two cardinals. He's a cardinal emeritus, sort of retired cardinal. Zen. He's been charged under the national security law. I just can't remember the details, whether he's still facing trial or what. But I think that sort of thing will probably continue for anybody who takes a political stand.
Hi. So historically, in many places, epidemics of disease have had strong correlations with growth of interest in religious faith. I wonder if there's anything you could say about the effect of the pandemic on, rates or anything to do with religion, and also whether the sort of what appears from the outside to be a somewhat bafflingly strict crackdown on trying to have zero COVID has any relationship to, like, I feel like I have no idea why they're doing that, has any relationship to the sort of crackdown on civil society or the desire to reduce that?
Yeah, in terms of religion, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago about the initial response, that there were faith-based groups that were responding to when it was isolated to Wuhan and they were trying to send masks and stuff like that, hospital equipment. So Chinese faith-based groups. In terms of the COVID crackdown in general, so if you want to see it from the government's point of view, I mean, one sort of the sort of Orwellian, Machiavellian point of view is that control is good, and this sort of control is going to stay forever. But if you want to look at it from a public health point of view and take a more generous, say, view, even if you have a fully vaccinated population with mRNA vaccines, you're going to have people dying, right? Even like in this country, I mean, of course, 1 million people have died in this country, right? But that was before the vaccines were widely used. And in China has not used mRNA vaccines. But even if they were to revaccinate the entire population with mRNA vaccines, you'd have a large number of people who would still get ill and would have to go to ICU wards. And Chinese hospitals are not really set up for that. Chinese hospitals don't have a lot of ICU wards. They're used as primary care facilities by most people. If you have a cold, you go to the hospital and they give you a drip. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but they don't, this is the way it's set up, and it needs to change, and there's efforts to change it. But so I think one of the problems is you would genuinely have hundreds, if not thousands of people who would die. And yet you could say, well, thousands of people die of the flu every year, but we don't lock down society so tightly. Then you get to the problem of the government's narrative. The government's narrative is any COVID death is bad, is unacceptable. So this is the problem. They sort of box themselves in the corner. If you say any COVID death is impossible, then it's really hard to unwind these controls. You're going to have quarantines for people coming into the country. You're going to have rolling lockdowns through the country, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, they'll have to find a way to get out of this, but they're going to have to, the first thing they're going to have to do is launch some kind of propaganda campaign to sort of reverse course and explain why it's now okay to have a few COVID deaths, I think. Sorry.
I want to ask about the sinicizing of the scripture text. I understood a few years ago that there was an attempt in China to rewrite the biblical text, and I'm wondering if you know something about that, and if so, are they really going to original documents to do so?
Yeah, I don't know the details of that. I know, I'm aware of the translation project. There are I do know there are serious scholars involved. I think they're going to the original texts, but I don't know that anyone has really seen a finished product or parts of the Bible that have been translated that might be problematic. I don't think that's really come out, to my knowledge at least. But I do know that there are serious scholars involved, and yeah, they're supposed to be using original text, etc.
So part of the zero COVID policy that came out of the news was these sort of AI-driven social score apps that included, if you were exposed to COVID, lockdown, that kind of thing. To what extent do you think religion or participation in religion is affecting somebody's social score, and how much is that overblown in terms of the widespread use of that app? Yeah,
that's a good question, especially the second part of your question. I think for now it's kind of overblown. I think it's the social credit system that they talk about, which is similar, say, to a driver's license points that you have. If you run a red light, you have so many points on your license, and when you get too many points, you have to go to a driver's ed class, and you get too many points, your license is taken away from you, or something like that. That this would be applied across the board if you had bad debt, if you did various other things, or perhaps if you engaged in political or religious activities. These are all potential uses of it, but there hasn't been any I think this could happen, but it hasn't happened yet. And when the pilot projects that have been discussed are more at the level of jaywalking and bad debt and things like that, which is, for us perhaps also a bit shocking. Like if you have a bad debt, then you can't buy an airplane ticket, which was the case in one of the cities in Shandong province, I think, where you weren't even allowed to buy a train ticket. You couldn't, your ID card was locked if you wanted to go buy that kind of ticket or something like that. So it's easy to extrapolate, not too many steps, and see how this could be used for people who do other things. But so far, it isn't being used in that way. But I think it's a possibility, I suppose. Yeah. I have to say one thing about that. For a lot of people, kind of like that. There's like so many people when you're on Chinese streets. There's so many people who are driving crazily, recklessly, in bike lanes, parking illegally. Like this is actually pretty popular. So if you get people like that and you nail them in some way, I think a lot of people are pretty happy about that. I mean, maybe you feel the same way about things. I don't know. Living in New York City, the number of electric motorcyclists who are driving their bicycles, delivery guys down the sidewalk. I keep thinking it would be great to sort of have some way to limit that. But anyways, sorry.
Okay. Do you know anything about Beijing International Christian Fellowship?
Yes.
Okay, and I used to go there.
Yeah.
And I want to know what has happened because they lost their ability to rent the hotel. Do you know?
I don't know. Is the short answer. I didn't go to that. I went to another church. I do know they were getting into trouble because in the 2000s, I think Chinese people were coming in sometimes to the church. So it was meant to be held in a hotel. You're only allowed to go if you had a foreign passport. And then, but there are a lot of ethnic Chinese people who have foreign passports, like Chinese Americans or something like that. And they were going to the church, and then after a while, the guards, in the 2000s especially, whatever, people can come and go. And so then there were a lot of Chinese nationals who were going to the church. And I think that might have caused a bit of a problem. Then I heard they were cracking down on that, but I don't know any more about that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Ian, thanks over here. Thanks for your talk. Really informative. I wanted to know are there any people in political office who are also persons of faith, or is that mutually exclusive? You have to take some vow not to belong to a faith in order to advance in the party?
Right. All Communist Party members are supposed to be atheist. So, end of story. I mean, that's the rule. Now that pilgrimage site that I showed, with the guys doing the martial arts like that, the guy who ran it for many years was a Communist Party member, but he wore robes and said, "I am now the grand head of the Pilgrimage Association." And I said, "Aren't you a Communist Party member?" And he said, "Oh yeah, but this is just cultural heritage." And I'm like, okay. So I mean, it seems to be perhaps more flexible if you're in that kind of a field. But I think, but overall, no. Party members are supposed to be atheists.
Hey, is there an expectation, I guess, for religious leaders to maybe be a mouthpiece for the party or to promote party agenda? And also along those lines, is the party maybe looking to exert its influence through like religious society?
Yeah, I think the religious authorities are supposed to support the party's agenda to some degree. I mean, they don't, to my knowledge, they don't stand up at the pulpit and say, Xi Jinping's great, and isn't it wonderful that he got a third term and stuff like that. They're supposed to be rather just maybe giving homilies on the scriptures and that sort of thing. And then they do things that sort of support government priorities in terms of charity work. So you'll often see the head of the Buddhist Association or the Protestant Association handing some like large check to a government official if there's some mudslide or something like that. And that isn't to say that there aren't genuine donations from religious believers, but a lot of that thing is just, I think, part of their duty to show that they're supporting, they're good members of society and helping out. I mean, I think that the noticeable thing about religious leaders is their lack of presence in the Chinese media. Like if there's some big event or there's some, I don't know, like a loss of life or something, you never see religious leaders quoted in the local media. You never see people asked about questions about morality. Often in social media there are these crises where these videos go viral where somebody doesn't help somebody out, and you never see religious leaders quoted in articles about that. So it's striking how they're sort of erased from the public sphere.
So with the Abrahamic religions, it sounds like we have the officially sanctioned versions of these, and then you've got the underground churches. I'm wondering, for the local Chinese population, what is the draw to the kind of unsanctioned underground religious institutions if they've got a very similar? What's the difference? What's the draw?
Yeah, I mean, so the official churches are great if you want to check in Sunday for 60 minutes, and go home. And then often the churches are so overcrowded because the official churches, because there aren't that many officially sanctioned churches in big Chinese cities, so they'll have like 5 services, and you'll just go in and you'll be it's sort of like a factory type thing. You don't get to know people there. You don't get to know the pastor. There's no pastoral work really done. Some of them have started to do things like Bible study, but not a whole lot. So I think the thing about the unregistered churches is they tend to be smaller scale. Even the mega churches started out as small Bible study groups that coalesced naturally and formed a big church. And so you get more of a feeling and I think they organize more social activities, even though some of them have been limited, but they will have things like, let's all go out on the weekend cherry picking or something like that, just fun stuff that people I think in any big city, especially when they move there, maybe to go to university or just because their job takes there, they don't have a network of people they know, and the churches provide that. Churches are kind of better at that than the traditional religions, because the traditional religions are often they don't sort of meet every Monday or Tuesday or Sunday or Saturday at a certain time. You can go there, but there aren't necessarily services, and the services tend to be very esoteric, right? And you can't necessarily understand what's going on. I mean, there are efforts by people in those faiths to change that, but it tends to be something more like a mystery, kind of maybe like the way churches were 1,000 years ago, where you don't really understand what the guy's saying up at the, he's speaking in Latin, you don't understand anything that's going on, but that's part of the whole mystery, and he's communicating directly with God on your behalf, right? And a lot of the traditional religions still kind of have that template for religious experience, and that's, that's great for some people, but for other people it doesn't really do the trick.
With the attempt to promote sort of the traditional religions and co-opt the Catholic Church in particular, do you think that's the party recognizing that people actually have moral and religious interests and needs that the party are not equipped to provide? Or is it just straight down the line, Marxist, Maoist, religion is eccentric and dangerous, and we should be in this game and try to control it?
Well, no, I think they do realize that the traditional message, the communist message of these selfless heroes and stuff like that to emulate doesn't convince most people. And so they need to broaden their palette of of offerings to get people to buy into their vision of society. So they want people to, in the past you could see there were local leaders who said this about Christianity. I mean, there's an interesting documentary film on Christianity in Shanxi province. And the local party secretary, this is about 25 years ago when the film was made, he said, I like the Christians because they're good citizens. They don't cause trouble, they don't steal, they don't get into fights and all this stuff. They pay their taxes, and so it's great. Now, I don't think many party leaders would say that anymore. But so instead, they're trying to offer kind of other things that people can go to, like these traditional cultural practices.
We have time for one more question. Right in the middle.
So over the last few years, the Bible has been kind of removed from many churches and from online for that. So where are especially the house churches getting Bibles?
Getting Bibles isn't such a problem. I mean, there are Bibles printed in China, and you can buy. I haven't been in China in 2 years, so I'm not sure. But as last I know, you could buy Bibles pretty easily. At churches, you had them for sale. The official churches, right, had them for sale, or even the unofficial churches had them. So I don't think there's a need for Bible smuggling into China as much. But I mean, that was a thing for a while. But I think that's not such a problem. Perhaps it's changing, but I don't think so. Thank you.
Let's give Ian one more hand. So just a couple closing announcements here. First, we do have a few more copies of Ian's book. Suggested donation of $15 over there with Jean at the front desk. Another thing we have here at Upper House is we have a podcast. It's called the Upwards Podcast. And I got to interview Ian earlier today, and we talked about who Ian is, where he came from, what got him interested in China and other things. That episode will be coming out in a few weeks, so if you're interested, subscribe, and if you listen to podcasts, subscribe to the Upwards Podcast to get that. And then finally, we have a lot of really good food still, desserts. So as you get up, if you feel so inclined, grab some more gooseberry pastries on your way out. So thank you for coming here tonight, and go in peace.